Parshas Vayikra. This week's Parsha begins the third of the Chumashim, the third of the 5 books of Moses, which also goes by the name of Vayikra. Vayikra means, and he called. This is how, it's the very first word of the Parsha. Vayikra Moshe, he called, this is referring to the Almighty. Vaydaber Hashem elav me'ohel moed lemor. And Hashem spoke to him, meaning Moshe, from the Ohel Moed, from the tent of meeting, the inner sanctum of the Mishkan. So Rashi there says, what's it? So we have Vayikra el Moshe, Vaydaber Hashem elav. This is somewhat unusual, not unheard of, but unusual. There are a few other places where there's this language of Kriya. Kriya means he called. He called to Moshe. Most of the time, the recording in the Torah of the discussion or of the speaking by the Almighty to Moshe is Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. That's countless numbers of times. Here, Vayikra el Moshe, he called to Moshe. What does that symbolize? So Rashi says immediately, so Rashi says that this really stands as the paradigm of all discussions, all speakings, all commandments that the Almighty has. And it is a lashon chiba. It is a language of endearment. When you speak to someone, Chazal say, this teaches us derech eretz, it teaches us the proper mode of conduct when you're speaking to someone that you're not in the middle of a conversation with, that you should first mention their name. Chazal say that Hashem said, like he did the very first time that Hashem spoke to Moshe, which was at the burning bush, he says, Moshe, Moshe. He calls him by name. And Vayikra is this a similar expression for what the Malachei Hashares, what the ministering angels do when they call out to each other. V'kara ze el ze v'yamar kadosh kadosh kadosh. One calls to the other, and they say it's a language of endearment. It's a language of connection. Now there was something unusual about this voice that called out to Moshe. Rashi says this is all on the very first verse of this Chumash. Hakol holech umagila oznav. The voice was carried and entered, or is received by Moshe's ears. V'chol Yisrael lo shomim. The rest of Israel did not hear. In other words, it's only Moshe that heard. It's not the rest of Israel that heard. So, and Rashi also says that the phrasing here says, Vayikra el Moshe, Hashem called to Moshe, which implies exclusivity, only to Moshe. So, Aaron didn't hear. Lema'et es Aaron. And there are other commentaries who say it excludes everybody. Vayikra el Moshe, Vaydaber Hashem elav me'ohel moed. So this is a individual, private communication. Now, Rashi explains from the word me'ohel moed that the sound actually stopped. It just dropped when it reached the limits of the tent of meeting in the Mishkan. So you might think, says Rashi, Yochol, mibnei shakol namuch. You might have thought that it's because the sound, the voice was very soft, almost inaudible. Talmud lomar es hakol. It is the voice. What is the voice? Well, the voice is the same voice that is described in Tehillim, says Rashi. Kol Hashem b'koach, the voice of God in force. Kol Hashem b'hodor, Kol Hashem shover ozim, glorious sound, a sound that will crush or break cedar trees, etc. So, why does it say me'ohel moed? So Rashi says, Melamed shaya kol nifsak, to tell you that the voice stopped, came from the Ohel Moed and stopped within the Ohel Moed. So, what's this telling us? So I spoke about this with a number of Talmidei Chachamim. My friend and colleague, Reb Noach Weinberg, suggests that this is teaching us that there are certain impressions that only the Gedolim, only the great leaders, the ones steeped in divine wisdom hear, that nobody else hears. That's certainly a legitimate approach. One might also suggest that this is talking about relationships with people from a place of Kedusha. In other words, people throughout their lives can be closer to a source of Kedusha or farther. They can be closer to God or farther. And sometimes they get inspired. And that inspiration is somehow sourced, comes from the divine. Somebody gets inspired to move and develop from their status quo, from where they are, perhaps where they were raised, how they were raised. How does one person from a secular background just keep shuffling on, and another one becomes about tshuva. Another one becomes strong in his commitment to a Jewish observance. You have groups of people who get the message and others who don't. You have an entire nation that could get the message while others don't. That Am Levadad Yishkon, a nation that lives by itself. So what goes on? So first of all, there is an analogy. What Rashi describes is clearly not something that we observe on a daily basis in nature. That a voice that is powerful and so loud, and some of the Mefarshim say that the voice of God when he calling to Moshe was so loud that it was the equivalent of the voice that the entire world trembled when it heard on Mount Sinai. But here, it was mitzumtzam. Here it was contained within the four walls of the tent of meeting. It was an unusual and not a natural event. Now, we observe some similar types of events within what we'll call nature, within certainly the world as we observe today. When somebody leaves the supermarket and they want to find their car, they'll take out their clicker and they'll press it. And what happens? One car, the lights go flash on, or you'll hear a horn, and you'll say, okay, that's the car. In other words, we have a model for communication that is received by only one receiver. We have that with, if you open it, it would be a sorry state of affairs if all of the cars responded equally. You wouldn't know which is your car if all garage doors opened when you pressed a button, if all phones answered when you dialed a number. In other words, that there is this notion of you can communicate in a certain way with a certain signal, and it's picked up only by one recipient. And it could be that what Rashi is telling us here, based on the Midrashim of Chazal, is that this happens to us in our daily lives. I remember hearing from Reb Noach Weinberg, that he said in the name of the Klausenberg Rebbe, he said people think that God doesn't speak to them. And he said, in the name of the Klausenberger, he said, God speaks to everyone all the time. The problem is that we can't always decipher that voice because we're listening to other things as well. If you will, the tuner on the analog radio isn't fixed exactly in the right spot. So we have a challenge in our lives, which is, number one, for us to fix our tuner on the right spot so that we can receive the message. And there's another challenge, which is sometimes we hear the message and we note that nobody else does. And we get inspired and nobody else does. And we are called, in a sense, to do things that nobody else is responding to. Does it mean that it's wrong? Well, nobody else heard it. So how come only I am responding to the call? Think of, for example, Pinchas responding to the desecration of God's name in Chumash Bamidbar. So what the Torah is teaching us here is that there are kurios, there are callings from the divine that only limited numbers will hear. Sometimes that number is as small as one. And the fact that others don't hear it doesn't mean it's not legitimate. And when we are called, why is Moshe called by himself? I haven't seen the commentaries comment on this, other than sometimes we get a call because we are the ones who are responsible. Moshe is the one who's responsible here. That's quite clear. Daber b'nei Yisrael. Speak to the children of Israel. Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Almighty, says this to Moshe repeatedly. Speak to the children of Israel. It's your responsibility. The notion of selecting an individual and giving him or her a charge implies that that person is the one, is capable of carrying out that will. And in a certain sense, perhaps the only one capable, or the one most capable. Certainly when it comes to changing our lives, our own lives, we are the ones who are responsible. And the challenge is to listen to that call, to listen to the call of Kadosh Baruch Hu to us when we are in a place of holiness. The closer we get to God, the more we can hear his unique message to each of us as individuals. Have a good Shabbos.